Doge obliterating federal agencies and Elon Musk tweaking out in the Oval Office. Immigration terror ripping apart communities. Bombing foreign nations. Endless lawsuits. Firing tens of thousands of government workers. Declassifying the MLK assassination files. Accusing Barack Obama of sedition. Ginormous flags on the White House lawn. Pardoning insurrectionists. Gutting Medicaid. Erratic trade and tariff wars. Canceling Black History Month and Pride Month. And of course, the Epstein files. It's tempting to think that that last one, the Epstein files, doesn't belong on the list. Like maybe this one is actually getting away from Trump, which is why the barrage of new distractions are coming our way. Well, allow me to offer another perspective. Now, I'm not saying the Epstein files shouldn't be released or that they're merely a distraction, and it probably is getting away from Trump at this moment. Whatever is contained in those files either confirms our worst fears about power and sex trafficking, or worse. And whoever is in those files should be held to account because we owe that much to the victims of abuse. But what I do know is that when distractions reach a fevered pitch, it's often by design. It's page 1 of the con artist or magician's playbook. I'm Max from UNFTR with this very special report for the MeidasTouch network. A deep dive into the shadow crypto networks, conflicts of interest, and potential upending of our global monetary order. And I have a big ask of you today. Like, huge. Don't look over there at the distractions and the misdirection and chaos. Look right here. Because I have a story so unbelievable that it reads like fiction. The story of a heist, perhaps the greatest of all time, happening right now. And the thing that makes it seem like a work of fiction is that it's happening in broad daylight. Now again, the Epstein files may or may not be a deliberate misdirect, but the timing of this now decades-old scandal bubbling to the surface while Congress just created a pathway for Trump to become the wealthiest man on the planet is convenient. Oh, and by the way, that's the story here. Our story begins with the word seigniorage, an arcane term that defines how central banks make money. Well, Trump and the GOP-led Congress, with the support of several key Democrats, just cleared a path for Donald Trump to become one of the central bankers to the world. The only thing that makes this hard to believe is that they told us they were doing it. They told us how and why, and then they did it. So all Trump has to do now is sell it. The greatest salesman in the world just has to sell. Not to us, mind you. That part's over. We're done. He has 3.5 years to sell it to the world while he still has the power and the authority of the presidency. And after that, all bets are off. So settle in. It's story time on the MeidasTouch network. There are only 3 moving parts to the modern GOP playbook: cut taxes, deregulate, and steal resources. No matter what else is accomplished under a Republican administration, you can bet that these 3 are at the top of the list, if not the sum total of said list. Now, Donald Trump's first term was chaotic. He was undisciplined and corrupt, but even they managed to secure tax cuts. Now, in the years that followed, we, along with many others, cautioned the Democrats to pay attention to the base and to do more on economic issues, because the only thing that could deliver a second Trump term was a population in economic precarity. So as the Biden administration wore on, calls from the progressive left to move them toward economic policies that benefit the lower and middle classes grew louder and louder because we understood what was around the corner. A second Trump term would be catastrophic for the vast majority of Americans. And how did we know? Because they wrote it down. It's all right there in Project 2025. So instead, the Democrats ran on joy, a hard-right immigration policy, January 6th, and tax credits. So all Trump had to do was acknowledge that the economy was busted and the White House was his for the taking. The other thing that became obvious was that Trump 2.0 would be just as corrupt, but far more disciplined. They had a plan, and they had the people who could bring it to life. Scott Bessent, Stephen Mirren, Stephen Miller, Russell Vogt. The rest, though, they're just sycophants, from Kristi Noem to Marco Rubio to Pete Hegseth and Linda McMahon, just wind 'em up dummies who follow orders and compliment the president. Now, back to the agenda. Cut taxes, deregulate, and steal resources. The first item on the agenda was to enshrine Trump's original tax cuts and extend them where possible. Check. The other two proved elusive in Trump's first term because the GOP Congress was more of a wild card, and Trump hadn't yet completely taken over the party. This time, it's Trump's world from stem to stern, and they're pressing forward with all deliberate speed. Stealing resources used to come in two ways in America: dollar diplomacy or gunboat diplomacy. For 250 years, the American diplomatic playbook was one or the other. Either you make a favorable financial deal with us, or we'll just take what we need by force. So in many ways, Trump's tariff policy is the perfect blend of these two approaches. It's economic terrorism designed to destabilize the world's economy while pouring money into the U.S. government coffers. And it's working to an extent. The economy, as it's currently oriented, is pouring tariff revenue into the federal government at the expense of the U.S. consumer and the long-term economic arrangements of our trading partners. So that leaves the third act of the GOP playbook: deregulation. The attack on federal agencies is in and of itself de facto domestic deregulation, because you can't regulate something if there's no one there to regulate. And now that the Supreme Court has given the administration the green light to dismantle agencies entirely without congressional approval, the government is Trump's to reorder. But there's a bigger deregulatory gambit that impacts the entire world. And they just pulled that off too. So to understand what they just did, we have to zoom out and talk about the global order of currency. And if you hold this framing in your mind, cut taxes on the wealthy, hoard resources, deregulate, the heist will fit very neatly into our story. Now, this is where I really don't want to lose you. So here's a picture of Ghislaine Maxwell kissing Jeffrey Epstein. For 80 years, the architecture of global finance has been built on the foundation laid at Bretton Woods in 1944. To really grasp the importance of this conference, we have to first trace the evolution of money itself, though, to three distinct eras. Prior to 1944, the global monetary system operated on what economists call the classical gold standard. Currencies were pegged to the physical stores of gold, creating a rigid but theoretically stable international framework. When you held a dollar, or a pound, or a franc, you held a promise that could be redeemed for a specific amount of gold. So the system provides certainty, but it imposed severe constraints on national economic policy. In other words, there could only be as much money in circulation as there was gold held in central banks as collateral. It's why countries ran out of money during economic shocks and wartime. So the 1944 Bretton Woods Conference fundamentally transformed global finance by establishing the US dollar as the world's primary reserve currency, still pegged to gold at $35 an ounce. The system granted the United States what would later be called an exorbitant privilege, the ability to print the world's money and export inflation to other nations. So every other currency was pegged to the dollar, which was itself pegged to gold, creating a pyramid with the American monetary policy at its apex. Then, on August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon announced what was supposed to be a temporary suspension of dollar-to-gold convertibility.
I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
That temporary measure, though, became permanent, ushering in the era of pure fiat currency. So the dollar remained the global reserve currency, but now it was backed not by gold, but by the belief that the U.S. government would remain stable and honor its debts and obligations in the world. By hook or by crook, by trade or by force, the good old gunboat and dollar diplomacy, as it were. Now, in practical terms, imagine a manufacturer in Rwanda wants to buy an industrial boiler from a Canadian supplier. The Rwandan firm would negotiate with the Canadian company, each contemplating the value of the transaction in their own currency, but negotiating the contract in US dollars. But the transaction would occur through their banks, who would settle it in US dollars and convert to their respective currencies after settlement. And it all happens on bank ledgers and through banks that hold reserve currencies in multiple denominations, but most notably US dollars, because everyone involved has the faith in the long-term price stability of the dollar. It's a shared global recognition of uniform and stable value. Today, we stand at the threshold of a fourth era, a new digital layer on top of the traditional system. Digital tokens tied to stores of value, whether it's the US dollar, gold, or mixed holdings. Something called a stablecoin. The cryptocurrency ecosystem has evolved dramatically since Bitcoin's inception, sprouting various specialized digital assets such as stablecoins, meme coins, exchange coins, and payment coins. But stablecoins are designed to maintain consistent value by pegging to external assets like the US dollar or gold, and designed to facilitate everyday transactions. So in and of themselves, they're very useful vehicles. But beyond the coins and trading vehicles, there's a complex web of digital layers from blockchain infrastructure, digital security protocols, exchanges, wallets, custodians, issuers, and payment processors. Now, while the progenitors of the system envisioned pure peer-to-peer transactions that were instantaneous, transparent, and independent of government interests, some of that libertarian spirit has predictably dissipated over time, with major financial institutions and central banks getting into the game. Nowhere is the tension between public interests, private interests, crypto purists, and government entities more evident than the role of stablecoins. The current stablecoin revolution can be best understood through the lens of one of economics' most enduring and fascinating debates, the clash between John Maynard Keynes and Friedrich Hayek over the proper role of money in society. So, at the 1944 conference in Bretton Woods, John Maynard Keynes proposed a radically different international monetary system than the dollar-based framework that ultimately was adopted. So Keynes envisioned a supranational currency called the bankor, issued not by any single nation, but by an international clearing union, or ICU. So the bankor would serve as the primary unit of account for global trade, effectively acting as a global reserve currency managed by an international institution. Friedrich Hayek, on the other hand, offered a radically different vision in his 1976 book, The Denationalization of Money. So in the book, Hayek proposed abolishing government money altogether in favor of private currency competition. So under Hayek's system, any private institution, a bank, a business, even an individual, could issue their own currency. Interesting, right? So currencies would compete in an open market, with users naturally gravitating towards those that best maintain stable purchasing power. And today's stablecoin system kind of represents the closest real-world implementation of Hayek's vision, but still with a sprinkle of Keynes. And I imagine that neither man would be entirely pleased. See, private entities in the stablecoin world issue digital currencies that compete for adoption based on their ability to maintain stable value. So right now, users can choose among USDT, USDC, USD1, which are the three primary coins that we're going to talk about today, along with dozens of other options, theoretically voting with their wallets so that the issuers that they trust the most get ahead. But there's a crucial irony here. Most stablecoins achieve stability not through Hayek's preferred commodity baskets, but by pegging to government fiat currencies, primarily the US dollar. So that's how the two men's visions have kind of come together. The philosophical tension explains why the stablecoin revolution has generated such fierce political opposition. Central bankers trained in the Keynesian tradition see stablecoins as an abdication of government responsibility for monetary stability, and they worry about financial stability risks, reduced policy effectiveness, and the potential for private entities to capture seigniorage. That's the profit that comes from money creation that has traditionally flowed to governments. Crypto advocates, though, whether they realize it or not, are fighting Hayek's battle against government money monopolies. And in fact, many crypto enthusiasts do pray to the altar of Hayek. They argue that competition will produce better, more efficient monetary systems than government bureaucracies ever could, which is becoming a familiar refrain. The resolution of this debate will determine not just the future of digital currency, but the future of money itself. So will the next chapter in monetary history be written by central bankers seeking to maintain government control through central bank digital currencies, which is Keynes, or by private innovators, Hayek? And because now we live in the upside down, one of the central characters in all of this may be none other than Donald John Trump, pictured here with pal Jeffrey Epstein. The current monetary system is built on decades of incremental additions to the Bretton Woods infrastructure, like a medieval city where each new building was constructed on top of the last. And at the heart of international finance sits SWIFT, the Society of Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication. Now, despite a name that implies speed, SWIFT is an archaic digital telegram service that allows banks to send payment instructions to each other. So when you wire money internationally, SWIFT doesn't actually move your money. It moves the message telling other banks to move your money. So a $10,000 wire transfer from New York to London doesn't trigger the physical or digital movement of $10,000 from an American bank to a British bank. Instead, it triggers a complex dance of accounting entries across multiple intermediary banks, each one taking a fee and adding processing time. And below SWIFT lies an even more arcane system, correspondent banking. So for a small bank in Ghana, let's say, to send money to a customer of a regional bank in Nebraska, neither institution likely has a direct relationship. So instead, they rely on a network of correspondent banks, larger institutions that maintain accounts with one another and agree to process transactions on behalf of smaller banks. So this creates kind of a hub and spoke system where major banks and financial centers like New York and London and Frankfurt serve as intermediaries for thousands of smaller institutions worldwide. And each hop in this network adds cost, delay, and risk. A simple international wire transfer might touch 6 or 7 different banks before reaching its destination, with each institution taking a cut and adding processing time. And at the top of this system sits central banks, like our very own Federal Reserve, which maintain accounts for commercial banks and process the final settlement of large value transactions. So this multi-layered system imposes enormous costs on the global economy. The World Bank estimates that remittances between migrant workers to their families cost an average of 6.18% in transaction fees. So for the approximately $700 billion in annual remittances, this represents more than $40 billion in fees extracted by financial intermediaries for the privilege of moving numbers from one computer to another. So that's why tokenizing transactions does have the potential to uplift many struggling areas of the world in the best case scenario. In the worst case scenario, it might transfer the fee capture from public concerns to private hands. Perhaps most importantly, the current system is slow. Sometimes it takes days for transactions to settle. So in an era when algorithmic trading occurs in microseconds, the idea that moving money requires multiple days is kind of absurd. And within that lag exists both risk and opportunity. Risk in that markets can move quickly. Between transaction and settlement, counterparties can default. Geopolitical situations can explode, and as we witnessed in the global financial crisis, entire systems can collapse. The opportunity is in replacing the entire system with digital tokens that settle in an instant. Enter stablecoins. There's a war out there, old friend, a world war. It's not about who's got the most bullets, it's about who controls the information. So this is from a long-forgotten 1992 movie called Sneakers, starring Robert Redford. So in it, his character leads a ragtag group of ex-spies and hackers who work for private contractors, but are forced into working for the NSA to track down a nefarious information-stealing criminal played by Ben Kingsley. And the movie always stuck with me because it was one of River Phoenix's last movies. And the above quote, delivered by the Kingsley character, also stuck with me because it proved so prescient. The race to build a stablecoin ecosystem is playing out like the competing interests in the movie. The NSA is the central bank trying desperately to hold on to its own authority. The sneakers crew are the crypto pioneers who believe in setting information free, and Ben Kingsley represents the private stablecoin cabal who know the value of controlling it all for greed and power. The most obvious question in any discussion of stablecoins is why we need private digital currencies at all when central banks could simply issue digital versions of their own currency. So central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs, would theoretically provide all the benefits of digital money, instant settlement, 24/7 availability, programmable transactions, while maintaining government control and eliminating the risks associated with private issuers. And here's the thing, these central bank digital currencies aren't theoretical. They exist. Chinese digital currency, already in widespread use, processing billions of dollars in transactions. The European Central Bank is actively developing a digital euro, and dozens of other central banks have pilot programs underway. So why the push for private stablecoins instead of simply adopting government-issued digital currencies? Here's where we begin building the case that the fix is in. In the US, the answer is simple. CBDCs have been explicitly prohibited by Congress. That's right. The recently passed Anti-CBDC Surveillance State Act prevents the Federal Reserve from directly issuing a central bank digital currency to individuals, and it blocks the creation of retail government-backed digital dollars. So it obviously passed the House and the Senate with overwhelming Republican support. And along the way, on the trio of bills that came forward, there was Democratic support. But there was very little Democratic support on this last bill, and it's the worst one and the most important of the trio of bills that recently appeared. So we'll talk more about the bills themselves later, but Republicans, with talking points from the crypto lobby, argued that retail CBDCs would theoretically allow the government to track every transaction, know exactly how much money every citizen has, and potentially control how that money can be spent. The technology could enable interest rates, effectively taxing savings, automatic tax collection, oh no, and the ability to turn off someone's money if they fall afoul of government policies. So in fairness, these concerns aren't purely hypothetical. In China, their digital currency features allow them to track all transactions and potentially restrict how the currency can be used. And the system's been integrated with their social credit system, allowing authorities to restrict financial services for citizens with low social credit scores. Of course, it doesn't have to be that way. Proof that the Chinese example is really just a smokescreen to cover for the development of a private stablecoin network is the European approach. The proposed digital euro would allow the ECB to retain control over monetary policy, even as digital payments become dominant. And European policymakers worry that without a digital euro, American payment companies and stablecoin issuers could gain excessive influence over European commerce. The U.S. Congress, on the other hand, just ceded control to the private marketplace to essentially stand in for the Federal Reserve. So instead of the government tracking all the things that they fear, private companies will be able, theoretically, to do all those same things. So the Fed's existing payment systems like FedWire and ACH are reliable, but decades behind modern technology. And we'll talk more about the legislation, like I said, that paved the way for this situation a bit later. But the American prohibition on CBDCs also creates international competitive pressure. See, if other countries develop efficient digital currencies while the U.S. relies on private stablecoins, those government currencies could gain advantages in international trade and finance. A Chinese digital yuan that settles instantly and costs nothing might be more attractive to international traders than a private American stablecoin that charges fees and is subject to the whims of private companies. So this puts the Fed in a pretty impossible situation. As the issuer of the world's reserve currency, the Fed has a responsibility to ensure the dollar remains the dominant international currency, but it's been prohibited from issuing a digital version of that same currency, potentially ceding the digital payment space to private actors, I wonder who, or foreign governments.
Stablecoins could reinforce dollar supremacy, because with stablecoins, stablecoins could end up being one of the largest buyers of U.S. treasuries or T-bills.
Okay, so let's rewind a couple of months and figure out how this all came together in Congress so quickly under Trump 2.0. Of course, the transformation of American cryptocurrency policy didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't by accident. It was the result of a carefully orchestrated legislative campaign that culminated in 2025 with the passage of 3 landmark bills that collectively reshape the regulatory landscape for digital assets. Now, understanding how these bills passed and who supported them reveals the political machinery that the crypto industry has built to advance its interests. So we've got the Genius Act, which established a comprehensive regulatory framework for payment stablecoins, moving oversight to the Treasury Department and creating a federal licensing system for stablecoin issuers. Then we've got the Clarity Act, dividing regulatory responsibilities between the SEC and the CFTC, generally moving crypto oversight from the more restrictive SEC to the industry-friendly CFTC. And the Anti-CBDC Surveillance State Act, prohibiting the Federal Reserve from issuing a retail central bank digital currency, effectively preserving the market for private digital currencies. So the Genius Act achieved bipartisan support in both chambers, which wasn't surprising given many representatives and senators who voted in favor of it represent states with significant financial service industries or technology sectors that stand to benefit from a crypto-friendly environment. But it also reflects the influence of targeted campaign contributions and lobbying efforts that we'll examine in great detail. The Clarity Act also passed the House with significant bipartisan support, including 79 Democrats joining Republicans and including co-sponsors from both sides. Now, this might be more concerning on the part of complicit Democrats because it effectively reduces SEC authority in favor of the CFTC. We'll talk more about that later. So the SEC, under both Democratic and Republican administrations, has generally taken a more skeptical view of cryptocurrency, while the CFTC has been more accommodating for industry interests. And at the end of the episode, I'll share another example of when this happened with pretty disastrous results. But it was the third one. It was the Anti-CBDC Surveillance State Act that revealed the starkest divide along partisan lines, passing the House with overwhelming Republican support, but only 2 Democrats joining. So this bill, primarily sponsored by Tom Emmer and supported by other House Republicans, represents the libertarian wing of crypto advocacy, the belief that government should stay out of digital currency entirely. And while many Democrats are willing to support regulation that legitimizes private crypto companies, they're less enthusiastic about legislation that explicitly constrains government options. But here's my problem with it. Knowing that these 3 bills were going to be tied together and work in conjunction over the next 3.5 years to build a private stablecoin enterprise that takes authority away from the central bank means that Democrats should have fought them all tooth and nail, but especially the last one. So we have to talk about these Democrats because the ones that supported this bill represent an interesting cross-section of the party. So some, like Kirsten Gillibrand and Mark Warner, come from states with significant financial service industries. But there's another pattern. Many of these Democrats received huge campaign contributions from crypto companies and individuals. So Gillibrand received over $200,000 in donations from individuals associated with prominent crypto firms, including Coinbase, Ripple, and Andreessen Horowitz. So the passage of these bills represents more than just a policy victory for the crypto industry. It represents a fundamental shift in how Congress views digital assets. So crypto is no longer treated as a speculative bubble or a threat to financial stability, but as a legitimate part of the American financial system, deserving of regulatory clarity and protection. All good. But the transformation of American cryptocurrency policy represents one of the most successful lobbying campaigns in recent memory, and there's more bad with this than there is good. The scope of this influence operation is unprecedented, by the way. Crypto corporations spent over $119 million directly influencing federal elections in 2024 alone, making them the dominant corporate political spenders in the cycle. So to understand the magnitude of crypto political influence, consider this. 44% of all corporate money contributed during the 2024 elections came from crypto backers. This means that crypto companies outspent every other industry, including traditional heavyweights like oil, pharmaceuticals, and defense contractors. Even Koch Industries, long considered the gold standard for corporate political influence, was a distant second place with $25 million in contributions. Perhaps one of the biggest losses for the country was former Senate banking chair Sherrod Brown. Brown lost his re-election campaign to Republican Bernie Moreno, a crypto enthusiast who benefited from more than $40 million in crypto PAC spending. Gillibrand, the junior senator from my home state of New York, is a perfect case study in how influence works in this system. So as we mentioned, during the 2024 cycle, Gillibrand received over $200,000 in donations from individuals associated with prominent crypto firms. And in just a matter of months, Gillibrand went from being pretty neutral and quiet on crypto to becoming one of the lead Democratic sponsors of the Genius Act, providing crucial bipartisan cover for the legislation. And it looks like these efforts, by the way, are just getting warmed up. Fairshake and its affiliated PACs have raised over $140 million for the 2026 midterm elections, with $109 million raised since the 24 elections ended. So this suggests that the industry views its 2025 legislative victories not as an endpoint, but a foundation for further regulatory capture. With the regulatory framework now in place and political resistance largely overcome, we can begin to envision how a stablecoin-dominated monetary system would actually function. So under the new regulatory framework, licensed stablecoin issuers compete for market share based on factors like transparency, reserve quality, redemption reliability, and transaction costs. So this creates a Hayekian competition among private currencies where market forces, rather than governments, determine which monetary systems succeed. The current market leaders are Circle, USDC, and Tether, USDT. So we'll focus on them along with a new kid on the block, the Trump family's World Liberty Financial Coin, USD1. So part of the seigniorage revenue model is the profit earned by issuers through investing their reserves back through their tokens. So when users purchase stablecoins, issuers invest the corresponding dollars in short-term treasury bills or other low-risk assets, keeping the interest while maintaining sufficient liquidity for redemptions. So this creates substantial revenue opportunities. For reference, the market leader is Tether's USDT, which generates approximately $123 million per week in fees and reserve income, translating to roughly $6.4 billion annually. Now, Circle's USDC generates about $31 million a week, or approximately $1.6 billion annually. And these figures demonstrate the enormous profit potential in capturing just a fraction of global payment flows. And so now it should be clear exactly what the Trump family has its eyes on. And it's all happening very, very fast. Stablecoins are rapidly integrating with existing payment infrastructures through on and off ramps that allow seamless conversions between stablecoins and traditional currency. And perhaps nowhere are the advantages of stablecoins more apparent than in cross-border payments. So think of our example of an international wire transfer that costs an average of 6.18% in fees and can take days to settle. Stablecoin transfers can cost pennies and settle in minutes, regardless of geographic distance or time zones. So there are strong business use cases in addition to this. For example, supply chain payments could automatically trigger when shipments are delivered, or insurance claims could just be paid automatically. Businesses can automate treasury management. International suppliers can receive instant payment upon delivery, and complex multi-party agreements can be executed without traditional intermediaries. So as more and more merchants offer stablecoin as payment methodology, the more consumers are incentivized to stock up on stablecoins. And the more consumers stock up on stablecoins, the more merchants are incentivized to come into the payment systems, and so on and so forth. And that's how the cycle grows. So we're looking at the revenue numbers that these companies already have, but think about the positive feedback loop that this kind of creates, which can lead to widespread adoption really quickly. But there's risk for every reward. A run on a major stablecoin issuer could trigger broader financial instability, especially if traditional banks hold significant stablecoin reserves or if a critical infrastructure depends on stablecoin payments. The interconnectedness also creates forms of monetary policy transmission. So If a significant portion of economic activity occurs through stablecoins backed by treasury bills, Federal Reserve interest rate changes could have amplified effects on the broader economy. So this is perhaps our first clue as to why Trump is so determined to replace Jerome Powell with Scott Bessent, a crypto believer and a Trump ally. The rise of stablecoins represents more than just a technological upgrade to the payment system. It threatens to fundamentally alter the balance of power between public and private institutions in ways that haven't been seen since the creation of central banking itself. As stablecoins gain adoption and capture an increasing share of monetary transactions, the central banks face the prospect of losing control over the levers that they've used to manage economies for over a century. Let's look at the role that central banks play in the global economy using our own example. The Federal Reserve's primary tools include setting interest rates, managing the money supply, serving as lender of last resort, and regulating commercial banks. These tools work because the central bank sits at the apex of a hierarchical system where all money flows depend on central bank liquidity. When the Fed raises interest rates, commercial banks face higher costs for borrowing reserves, which they pass on to their customers through higher loan rates. This reduces demand for credit, slows economic activity, and helps control inflation. All of this theoretical, some in practice. Now, stablecoins threaten to bypass this entire system. If individuals and businesses hold stablecoins instead of bank deposits, and if the transactions settle directly on blockchain networks instead of through the traditional banking system, then commercial banks lose their role as monetary intermediaries, and central banks lose their control over commercial banks. So consider a scenario where a significant portion of economic activity occurs through stablecoin transactions. Workers receive salaries in stablecoins. Businesses pay suppliers with them. And customers make purchases using stablecoin-enabled payment systems. In this scenario, traditional bank deposits shrink. Interbank settlement volumes decline. And the Federal Reserve's interest rate decisions have less impact on the real economy. Perhaps more fundamentally, though, widespread stablecoin adoption would transfer the profits of money creation from the public sector to private companies. So Tether's $6.4 billion in revenue, Circle's $1.6 billion in revenue, those represent funds that would otherwise go to government sources as revenue. These numbers are small now, but you can extrapolate the potential over time as adoption increases. This revenue transfer could amount to tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars annually, representing a privatization of what has traditionally been a government revenue source. So while the true end the Fed libertarians would celebrate a reduced role of central banks, these banks serve as guardians of financial stability, monitoring systemic risks and providing emergency liquidity during crises. Consider the potential for a stablecoin run. If confidence in a major stablecoin issuer deteriorates, holders might rush to redeem their tokens for traditional dollars. But if this issuer's reserves aren't invested in longer-term assets, and if redemption mechanisms become overwhelmed, the stablecoin could depeg from the dollar, which would trigger broader financial instability. And this happened once already in the case of Silicon Valley Bank, which almost destabilized the entire U.S. banking system, necessitating once again the Fed to stand in and prop it up. More on that one in a bit. In a pure stablecoin economy, the Federal Reserve has limited tools to address such a crisis. It can't serve as lender of last resort to a private stablecoin issuer in the same way that it can to banks. It can't guarantee stablecoin redemptions in the same way that it guarantees bank deposits through FDIC insurance. And it can't directly inject liquidity into stablecoin networks in the way that it has traditionally done in the banking system. So in the extreme case, large stablecoin issuers could become shadow central banks, wielding enormous influence over economic activity without the democratic accountability or public interest mandates that constrain traditional central banks. A handful of private companies could control the monetary infrastructure that enables all of this economic activity, giving them the power over interest rates and credit allocation and financial stability that rivals or even exceeds that of central banks. Now, once again, for those in the back, imagine Eric Trump and Donald Trump sitting at the center of these kind of decisions. That's what's at stake here. John Maynard Keynes became the leading figure at Bretton Woods because of his experience navigating 2 world wars and the Great Depression. His presence at the conference was a signal that someone who cared about the future of the world and was battle-tested to the extreme would have his fingerprints all over the global monetary order. And the innovations that came out of Bretton Woods are the stuff of legend. In 22 days, they completely reordered a broken global financial order. Modern dollar-backed currency and reserves, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank. Keynes gave order to a world devastated by chaos, defaults, war, and destruction. And it directly contributed to U.S. hegemony and the dominance that persisted until today, and perhaps only to this day. So in the background to this, opposition to Keynes's plan developed almost immediately through the auspices of the neoliberal economists led by Friedrich Hayek, although today we most closely associate them with the Chicago School economists led by Milton Friedman. For nearly 3 decades, they toiled in obscurity until the stagflation crisis of the 1970s opened the door for new thinking in the Western economies. Keynesian responses had failed us, or so they said. New thinking was required. And there, with the answer packaged and ready to implement, was the Mont Pelerin crew, with the U.S. faction having taken residence at University of Chicago. Today's true crypto visionaries, many of whom remain anonymous, believe it or not, are adherents to the pure Hayekian vision of private currencies and complete decentralization and deregulation of the monetary order. The Trump cabal and other crypto pirates looking to replace central banks for their own gain are much closer to the sellout Chicago School economists and their acolytes. But lost in this equation are the pure Keynesians who understood how private markets led to global instability, greed, and corruption, and how these factors can lead to devastating wars and depressions. And it may well be the case that when the next era is written about, they'll be speaking in terms of the Keynes era from 1944 to 1971, the Hayek and Friedman era from 71 to 2025. And if you can imagine it, the Trump era from 2025 until the whole thing falls apart again. The most immediate and tangible benefit of stablecoins is their dramatic improvement in transaction speed and cost, especially for cross-border payments. Traditional international wire transfers can take days to settle and cost 6 to 7% in fees, while stablecoin transfers settle in minutes for pennies. This efficiency gain is not marginal. It is transformational for businesses that rely on international commerce and life-changing for migrant workers sending remittances to family members. Financial inclusion represents perhaps the most compelling social benefit of stablecoins. Traditional banking requires physical infrastructure, regulatory approval, and minimum account balances that exclude billions of people worldwide from formal financial systems. Stablecoins require a smartphone and an internet connection, instantly providing access to dollar-denominated savings and payment systems regardless of geography or economic status. Stablecoins also promise to eliminate much of the inefficiency that characterizes the current financial system, with layers of intermediaries that extract fees while adding little value. The disintermediation could free up trillions of dollars, in theory, in capital that's currently trapped in settlement delays. It could also result in tens of thousands of job losses, and that's not even the biggest risk. The most immediate and significant risk is depegging, the possibility that a stablecoin could lose its parity with the underlying asset that it's supposed to track. So take our Silicon Valley Bank example from March of 2023. This crisis provides a preview of how quickly depegging can occur and spread. So what happened was Circle's USDC temporarily lost its dollar parity when it was revealed that Circle held about 8% of its reserves at a failing bank. So the depegging rapidly withdrew $3 billion from SVB, accelerating the bank's collapse and demonstrating how stablecoin instability can amplify traditional banking crises. So as stablecoins become more deeply integrated into the financial system, these kind of depegging events could trigger broader systemic instability. So if businesses rely on stablecoins for payroll, Suppliers depend on them for payments, and financial institutions hold them as reserves. A major stablecoin failure could propagate through the economy just like a traditional bank run. But unlike banks, stablecoin issuers don't have access to central bank emergency lending or government deposit insurance. So if confidence in a major stablecoin deteriorates, there's no equivalent to the Federal Reserve's discount window or the FDIC's deposit guarantee to prevent such a catastrophic run. Stablecoins also create new opportunities for regulatory arbitrage that could undermine financial stability and law enforcement. So as much as transparency is theoretically a feature of blockchain technology, because stablecoins can be transferred instantly across borders without traditional banking intermediaries, it also makes it easier to evade capital controls, to evade sanctions, and anti-money laundering requirements. So just because something can be seen doesn't mean that it's going to be caught if no one's looking for it. Now, it's likely that much of this activity would happen in smaller and less regulated countries. So more to the point, widespread stablecoin adoption could lead to a loss of monetary sovereignty for these same nations. Then there's the environmental concern. Many stablecoins operate on blockchain networks that consume significant energy for transaction processing and security. While newer, more efficient blockchain technologies are being developed, the environmental impact of large-scale stablecoin adoption remains a concern, especially as transaction volumes grow. And now for the nitty-gritty. The transformation of American cryptocurrency policy cannot be appreciated without dissecting the intricate network of relationships, financial interests, and political influence that surrounds Donald Trump's return to power. At the center of this network sits World Liberty Financial, the Trump family crypto venture that's become a vehicle for both massive profit and potential conflicts of interest. So the company's USD1 stablecoin launched recently amid considerable fanfare during what organizers described as a fireside chat between Eric Trump and Zach Witkoff, moderated by Chinese crypto mogul Justin Sun. World Liberty Financial has secured deals worth over $2 billion, including controversial investments from entities with pretty questionable transparency. So the most striking example is the $100 million investment from Aqua One Foundation, an entity that appears to exist primarily as a website, registered on May 28, 2025, with no corporate registration or official filings discoverable in any public databases. So the company's original social media accounts were suspended. And blockchain watchers noted that its funding appears to have originated from crypto exchanges recently fined for anti-money laundering violations. Jacob Silverman of The Nation, by the way, has done the most extraordinary reporting on this so far, and it's worth a read to understand just how murky and opaque the Trump financial network truly is, although I doubt anyone will be surprised. Trump's stablecoin venture represents a direct path to capturing seigniorage. It's just a handful of countries away from adopting USD1 to gain significant portions of their international trade. So in doing so, the Trump family could earn hundreds of millions of dollars annually from the interest on reserves backing their stablecoin. As it is, they're said to have pocketed $57 million on just the launch of USD1 alone. So if the US government suddenly shows preference for USD1 in its own operations, or it encourages more allies to adopt it, Trump could potentially become one of the wealthiest individuals in the world through what amounts to a privatized central banking operation that we gave him. The Trump administration's crypto-friendly appointments represent textbook regulatory capture, where former industry executives and advocates are placed in positions to regulate the very sector they used to promote. So there's Brian Quintenz, who we already mentioned before, who moved from CFTC commissioner to the head of crypto policy at Andreessen Horowitz and back to CFTC chairman. Or Howard Lutnick, former CEO of Cantor Fitzgerald, who now serves as Secretary of Commerce. Cantor Fitzgerald acts as a major custodian of Tether's reserves. Scott Bessent, formerly George Soros' chief investment officer, has become a champion for crypto integration as Treasury Secretary. Soros Fund Management, by the way, has significant investments in the crypto blockchain and exchange infrastructure. Each appointment represents a position where official government policy directly benefits the appointee's former or future private sector interests, Perhaps most concerning are the international financial flows that appear designed to obscure their true origins. Remember that $2 billion deal with the Abu Dhabi government fund, facilitated through World Liberty Financial's token sales? This created a direct financial relationship between the Trump family and a foreign government. When combined with Binance's behind-the-scenes technical assistance to build USD1, provided by a company whose founder was charged with money laundering and is now seeking a presidential pardon, the arrangement raises some pretty significant questions about foreign influence and financial transparency. The network extends far beyond the Trump administration to include a constellation of crypto industry figures who've positioned themselves as power brokers in the new administration. Don Jr., prominent crypto figure in financing, serving as an investor and partner in American Bitcoin, a cryptocurrency mining company that recently raised $220 million. Michael Saylor, the corporate Bitcoin evangelist whose MicroStrategy has acquired massive Bitcoin holdings, benefits from strategic reserve policies championed by Commerce Secretary Lutnick. And Count Dracula himself, Peter Thiel, continues to exert behind-the-scenes influence through his investments and connections to pro-Trump Silicon Valley networks. And as for Justin Sun, his $75 million investment in World Liberty Financial the day before Trump's inauguration was followed by the SEC's decision to halt fraud proceedings against him. The Trump crypto network creates the ultimate accountability gap, a system where critical policy decisions are made by people with direct financial stakes in the outcomes, where foreign money can influence domestic policy through private business relationships, and where the benefits of public policy changes flow primarily to politically connected private entities. And behind it all is the bigger question of whether the system can provide the stability, equity, and democratic accountability that monetary systems require. The last time we had a global financial monetary order in private hands was the 1920s. And so can anybody tell the class what happened just after the 1920s? Bueller? Let's talk about mythology. Kennedy, Getty, Rockefeller, surnames of titans who grew their empires during the Great Depression. And there is this mythology that develops about great men and their fortunes, but the reality is that the Great Depression wiped out nearly everyone. There were the lucky few who felt a disturbance in the force and shorted the market, like Kennedy. Others like Getty and Rockefeller who had enough capital to feast on the carcasses of the dead and dying competitors they faced. But for the most part, the Depression spared almost no one. Even the giants of the financial world, like Goldman Sachs, nearly came to ruin. The House of Morgan, which essentially financed the great powers in World War I behind the scenes, tried to step in to prop up the market during the Depression, but to no avail. And here's the thing about money. Whether it's flowing up or down or around, it flows. And for every dollar that flows through the economy, there's someone taking a cut. Now today, it's several cuts going to many. But tomorrow, it may just be one cut, split a handful of ways. Now there are those who think it would be delicious irony if Trump became one of the handful of pockets that were filled, even if he was the one to bring about the next Great Depression. A fitting end to the American experiment, they would say, taken down by our own ignorance and xenophobia, pitiless racism and hypernationalism. I mean, we put this guy in once, and he nearly killed us all by mismanaging a pandemic before promoting an insurrection on his way out, only to invite him back again. It's hard to suggest that we wouldn't deserve it. A stablecoin regime could artificially prop up the treasury for a period of time, a few years maybe a decade. But a deregulated global market means there's no guarantee that the US dollar even remains the primary asset peg. Along the way, the Federal Reserve's economic management tools would be effectively neutered. So who becomes the lender of last resort to pour liquidity into broken markets when the Fed's dry powder and influence runs dry? The overnight settlement market went into negative territory twice this year already, prompting the Fed to intervene. It intervened during COVID with the largest infusion of cash and interest rate manipulation since the global financial crisis. It stabilized the markets when the repo markets collapsed in 2019. It purchased toxic assets from reckless banks during the global financial crisis, lowered interest rates to effectively zero for a decade. Now, free market ideologues like to play fast and loose. And that's how fortunes are made, right? And there's a handful of the mythologized and lionized titans who feasted on the weak during the Great Depression, so they believe there's always an angle and a way to win while everyone else loses. So they're okay with zero sum. They're okay with winner takes all, economic Darwinism, whatever you want to call it. But like every crash before and every crash in the future, it has always been and will always be the result of hubris and greed. So to wrap this up neatly, I'll finish with a quick story that should have been the ultimate cautionary tale. There's a woman named Wendy Graham, who was the head of the CFTC from 1988 to 1993, where she championed deregulation and reforms to reduce oversight into risky trading. And shortly after she left there, she joined the board of Enron. And while she was at Enron, her husband, Phil, was busy preparing two critical pieces of legislation. One to repeal a significant part of Glass-Steagall of 1933 that separated investment banks from commercial bank deposits, and the Commodities Futures Trading Act that deregulated a risky asset class known as derivatives. So this allowed companies like Enron to engage in speculative energy trading despite being an energy provider. So when Congress repealed Glass-Steagall with the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act in 1999, it was done under the cloak of darkness and during chaos during the holidays and signed into law by Bill Clinton. And now listen closely to the key objectives and goals that these laws were designed to achieve. The purpose of the legislation was to modernize the banking system so we could compete internationally in the free market. And within 2 years, Enron collapsed under the weight of the biggest trading scandal in modern history. And in less than a decade, the entire global financial system was brought to its knees. The Federal Reserve and the U.S. Treasury stepped in and saved the U.S. economy from another depression. Now, did the Fed hold interest rates at zero for too long? You bet. Did it save institutions unworthy of such largesse and grace? Absolutely. Did it prioritize banks and large corporations over Main Street and the consumer? 100%. But did it stave off a global depression? Yeah. In an effort to modernize the financial system to be more competitive, Republicans led the charge to create new financial instruments. They created two separate bills, one to deregulate the industry and one to allow these new speculative assets to be regulated by the more Wall Street-friendly CFTC. Very few of those who voted for it understood what they were voting on, but financial lobbying interests convinced them it would be good for the country. You spot the differences, because I'm having trouble doing it. Only next time, the lender of last resort and the person holding the fate of the global economy in their hands might be Donald Trump. Or if fate and Donald Trump's arteries have other plans, it could be Eric. For the MeidasTouch Network, I'm Max from UNFTR. For the essay and the full list of sources that accompany this episode, visit unftr.com. And while you're there, don't forget to sign up for our free weekly newsletter and browse our directory of progressive resources and full archive of content. You can catch me on YouTube and Blue Sky at UNFTR. And as always, thank you to the MeidasTouch Network and the Meidas Mighty. I'll catch you next time.
The truth is more important than ever. Check out our new Truth Over Lies collection at store.meidastouch.com. All 100% USA union made.